Furong village is an ancient town in Hunan province with a history of more than 2,000 years. With the majestic views of the 60-meter high waterfall, visitors can enjoy traditional Tujia architecture perched on cliffsides, adorned with colourful decorations and intricate carvings. Performances by locals offer visitors a glimpse into the Tujia way of life. It's beautiful, it's scenic, and it's also completely fake. Hello, and welcome back to Sinobabble. In this episode, I have to get something off my chest. Back in the day, when I was a lecturer at a university, one of the courses I had to teach was called History and Heritage. And this course was all about enabling students to kind of examine the tangible and intangible heritage sites of China, learn a little bit more about their national culture, and kind of appreciate both that culture and the way in which it's preserved. But what I got out of it more than anything else was an insight into the way that the cultural heritage, I guess, economy or industry works in China. Culture, cultural heritage, conservation, preservation, these are terms or practices that are very different in China to how they are perceived in the West. One of the main resources that we used during this course was a book called The Future of the Past by Alexander Still. He kind of visits different heritage sites around the world and explores their approaches to conservation in these different countries. He sums up the Chinese approach to conservation and preservation with a few different examples, one of which left me a little bit surprised. But I think is a really good summary, so I'm just going to read it to you right now. When Michel Cordaro, the director of Italy's Central Conservation Institute, went to visit the famous army of terracotta warriors in Lintong outside Xi'an, he was dumbstruck by what followed. His Chinese colleagues took him straight from the ancient site to a factory where they were churning out modern replicas of the emperor's tomb soldiers. The Chinese copies were carefully produced, with the government's permission, from moulds made from the original statues and speckled with small imperfections and flecks of mud as if they had been recently dug out of the ground. The vast majority of the warriors that have gone touring around the West are fakes, Cordaro said. We call them fakes, but the Chinese have a different sense of the value of the original and copy. I know cases where, at the insistence of museum directors, the Chinese have sent over, let's say, 5 originals and 25 copies, and almost no one can tell which are which. Now, I remember reading this for the first time and being like, huh? But I think the more I read about the cultural heritage industry in China, the more that I realized this was the prevailing attitude and approach to heritage and conservation. And I think that the contrast between this approach and, I guess, the Western, generally speaking, approach to conservation is worth exploring, because it begs the question, what is the value of authenticity in China's cultural heritage industry? Or essentially, does it matter that most of China's cultural heritage is fake? Now, it's worth pointing out here that, of course, China is not the only place to fake certain elements of its cultural heritage, or to rebuild tourist sites in imitation of the original. Shrines in Japan, for example, are famously kept fresh by frequently replacing certain parts of the crumbling architecture. The Chinese, like the Japanese and some other Asian nations, have a tradition of conserving by copying or rebuilding. The epitome of this seemingly Zen approach to conservation is the Ise Shrine in Japan, a Shinto temple originally built in the 7th century that is ritually destroyed and rebuilt every 20 years. The Japanese think of it as being 1,300 years old, yet no single piece of it is more than 2 decades old. This concept is so alien to Western art historians that UNESCO, after much fierce debate, excluded the Ise Shrine and many other famous Japanese monuments from its list of World Heritage Sites on the grounds that they were not ancient or authentic. The UNESCO standards are basically an imposition of the Western ideals of conservation and preservation that don't necessarily apply to other cultures around the world. And if you've ever been to, say, East or Southeast Asia, you can see lots of examples of these sorts of monuments or places that have been remade or remodeled based on what people think it should look like historically. I think a good example of this is the village of Hoi An in Vietnam, which I have visited and I personally didn't enjoy because it just felt very fake to me and I didn't like that, but other people were having a fabulous time, so, you know, what do I know? And even in Western culture, until a certain point in history, it used to be very common for us to change or manipulate or add on little bits to, say, statues from ancient Greece or ancient Rome until we were like, why are we doing this? So it's not as if this has always been our approach. It's something that has only developed in more recent years. But I think the case of China in particular is worth exploring because of the actual motivations behind its reconstruction of its heritage. It's not simply a case of rebuilding what was lost or updating what's fallen down, like in Japan, but there are more complex questions to explore around political motivations, cultural identity, and also money. So today we are talking about the reconstruction and renewal of monuments, relics, places, the reinvention of certain traditions and different practices in order to rebuild a sense of identity and also a thriving tourism market, both of which lend a sense of legitimacy to the CCP regime. But before that, of course, as always, we need to jump into the historical context to discuss why certain parts of China's cultural heritage would need rebuilding at all. There are countless Chinese regimes and different invading forces that have been responsible for the destruction of thousands of Chinese artifacts. Some famous examples from history include the mass book burning conducted by the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and the destruction of the Old Summer Palace by the British during the Second Opium War. But of course, the most famous example of mass destruction of Chinese cultural heritage in the modern period would be the Cultural Revolution. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but if you don't know what the Cultural Revolution is, essentially it's a period of mass social upheaval during the late Mao regime from 1966 to Mao's death in 1976. I have an entire 8-part series on this channel on that. Please go and listen to it because we do not have time to get into all the details today. But what we do need to know about the Cultural Revolution today is that apart from the mass interpersonal violence that took place, China's pre-existing culture also came under attack, as it was seen as holding China back from achieving its communist utopia. The main targets were any symbols of Western and bourgeois lifestyles that were called the Four Olds, so old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Chinese youths would march through the streets waving portraits of Mao and his Little Red Book, ransacking homes and temples, destroying Buddhist and Taoist relics, burning Confucian texts and translations of foreign works. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, it's estimated that 2.3 million books and 3.3 million paintings, art objects, and pieces of furniture were burned, and around 5,000 of the 6,800 official cultural and historic sites in Beijing alone were destroyed. Some of the most famous examples of places that were destroyed include Tianfu Square in Chengdu, which is now a huge tourist site with like a massive Mao statue and this big spirally thing that used to be an imperial palace, and also the original temple of Confucius in Qufu. Obviously, not everything was destroyed, particularly in remote areas or with less well-known, less well-documented artifacts. China is a big place and not everything of historical importance had even been discovered at the time. A good example of this would be the terracotta warriors that I mentioned earlier. They weren't actually discovered until the 70s, and then a big fuss wasn't made about them until towards the end of the Maoist regime in like 1975. So you would think that after the end of the Cultural Revolution, throughout the 80s and 90s, when China's opening back up to the world and its market economy is developing, that there might be a sort of realization that China had this amazing cultural heritage that it needed to explore and preserve. Well, not exactly. Even though the terracotta warriors were accidentally discovered by farmers in 1974, and the first museum on the site did open in 1975, the huge complex that we now know today that forms like this huge attraction with shops and tours and restaurants and things like that only opened up in 2010, almost 40 years later. An interest in antiquity, preservation, things like that, especially at a national level, doesn't just spring up out of nowhere. You have to have time, resources, money, trained experts who can actually explore these things. And as China was a poor country up until very recently, it didn't really have any of those means in order to explore its own heritage. It wasn't actually until the 2000s, when China was a bit richer, that intellectuals, especially in China, were able to advocate for the preservation of China's past. The book that I mentioned earlier, The Future of the Past by Alexander Still, was written in 2002, and the expert who was commenting about the terracotta warriors being manufactured in factories was invited from Italy to help set up this cultural study in China. So you can see that this is really the sort of beginning of this process. If you fast forward to today, over 20 years later, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these cultural villages, cultural heritage sites, these caves, grottos, temples, mountains, valleys, fields. They're all set up specifically for tourism. So that's all the historical context. But if we're talking about today, why exactly does China now feel so concerned about reclaiming its past? Part of that is to do with reclaiming this lost socio-cultural identity that was in the process of being dismantled in the post-Mao years. This idea of being a purely socialist state was transforming, and with that transformation, something that was lost needed to be recovered. In post-Mao China, rapid urbanization, mass migration, and unprecedented social and economic transformations have triggered a sense of identity crisis, loss, anxiety, and nostalgia. With the collapse of a Marxist vision of history, we see a fevered search for a national subjectivity that can restore a sense of historical agency to China in terms which are in some ways a striking departure from the Maoist era, but which in other ways are strangely continuous with it. China's historical past and heritage that were once considered an impediment to China's search for modernity were reinterpreted with new sources of national pride. But as we just pointed out, a lot of those sources of China's identity were destroyed, either spiritually throughout the entire Maoist regime, and particularly during the Cultural Revolution. So China really doesn't have any choice but to create fakes, in a sense. But luckily for China, this doesn't actually conflict with the prevailing attitudes towards culture and preservation and authenticity at all. It's partly a linguistic thing. So in the English language, we associate something being authentic as synonymous with its being the original version of something, or like the most recent version of something, something that has been untouched, untrammeled, and hasn't been tampered with. Whereas in Chinese, authentic and original are actually two different words with two completely different meanings. Some scholars use yuan zhenxing as the translation of authenticity, in which yuan means original, zhen means real and trustworthy. This understanding of the term highlights the significance of a building's original state. Other scholars prefer the translation zhenshi xing, in which the word zhenshi emphasizes only real, true, and verifiable as the core of authenticity. They argue that using yuan zhenxing will limit authenticity to the original state of any architectural heritage and neglect the historic development of a structure. This linguistic aspect has kind of seeped its way into the actual language of heritage conservation and preservation in China. Whereas in the West, we are more likely to treat preservation as kind of like a snapshot in time. In China, preservation of culture is more so reconstructing the past so that people can experience life as it was as much as possible. This view kind of came about in the mid-1960s. There was a man called Lian Zisheng. He was a very famous architect in China, and he basically came up with the view that in restoring architecture that has historic and artistic value, in general, we must follow the principle of restoring the old as it was. Now, as far as I can tell, in the West, another consensus was being followed. This was known as the Venice Charter for the Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites. which declared that the aim of any restoration process is to preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historic value of the monument, and is based on respect for original material and authentic documents. In China, they came up with a slightly different interpretation, which is known as the Declaration of Chufu, or the Consensus on the China-Specific Conservation Theory and Practices of Historic Buildings. Conservation with Chinese characteristics, if you will. According to this document, damaged ancient buildings can retain their scientific, artistic, and historic values if carefully repaired and scientifically restored by following the original designs, using original materials, adopting the original procedure, and applying the original techniques. These restored buildings should not be called fake antiques. The declaration suggests that buildings be restored to a healthy rather than ruinous or ramshackle state. In the event of any alteration in the historic condition, efforts should be made to restore the cultural heritage to its historic condition as early as possible. We are going to put a huge pin in this point because the extent to which this ideal of restoring buildings to how they should have looked historically is a matter of contention when you look at what the final product of many of these restoration attempts actually is. Over time, this view of what actually constitutes authenticity has slowly been shifted, shall we say, in the Chinese context. Let's talk about some examples of how China has kind of manipulated this approach to cultural heritage to create essentially Disney-fied versions of villages and palaces. We're going to start small and work our way up. So let's start with a place called the Mu residence in Lijiang. Now, this is probably a place that most Westerners haven't heard of, but I think it's a very good example because of the way that it has been restored. So the Mu residence was once the residence and work site of the Naxi rulers of Lijiang. So it was originally built in the Ming dynasty and was situated in the political centre of the Naxi community. Most of its houses were destroyed during the wars waged in the Qing dynasty and later in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. After Lijiang's inscription into the World Heritage List in 1997, the current residence was rebuilt in 1999 on the original site with funds from the World Bank. The current venture with Mu's residence is a reinvention of tradition where no historical information about the original architecture of its predecessor is available. The reconstruction did not even abide by the historical construction principles of Naxi culture. Nevertheless, the reconstruction of Mu's residence is regarded as an exemplary pilot project by the local government and is marketed as one of the main tourist attractions in Lijiang. Mu's residence is not an academically sound reconstruction, but the local government allegedly drew upon the idea of restoring old as it was, while reinterpreting the notion to maximize its local benefit. So we're going back to our first pin here, right? Liang Sicheng said that you should restore the old as it was, but here we have a prime example where you don't know what the old was. We don't know what it was. We have no idea what it looked like. And we know that there is a culture there that's not necessarily the Han majority culture, it's a Naxi culture, but the local government, either in the interests of time or money, just decided to bypass really trying to get to grips with this minority group's culture, heritage, historical architectural practices, and just skip to the part where they put the fancy pagoda ends that you always see on every single Chinese building on the end and call it a day. It's very jarring to see the local government kind of swoop in and take over this place, kind of riding roughshod over the people who would know about it, whether that be the academic community or the local residents, the local minority groups who have actually experienced that culture, especially when the place is being marketed as a kind of return to that place and that time. Another good example of this is the Shaolin Temple. Specifically, the Shaolin Temple I'm talking about is the one in Dongfeng County in Henan. This was known as the Imperial Temple and was built by Emperor Xiaowen of the Northern Wei dynasty in 496 AD. And over time, the Shaolin monks provided military support for imperial powers by developing Shaolin martial arts. They also provided instruction in Chan Buddhism, which is also known as Zen Buddhism in the West. And this dates all the way back to the Tang Dynasty, which is like the 7th century. Now, this Shaolin temple hasn't been exempt from the ups and downs of Chinese history. It's been destroyed and rebuilt over 20 times, including during the Republican period, during the war with Japan. During land reform under Mao, the temple and the monks who lived there were forced to actually give up most of their land, around 99%, so that poor peasants could come in and take over and move in. In the end, all that was left to the monks was just like a few rooms and beds for 14 people. And so that's kind of how the temple existed throughout the Maoist period. Again, a case of people not really appreciating the cultural history kind of being thrown to one side. But in the post-Mao period, funnily enough, it was the success of a film, The Shaolin Temple, which starred Jet Li in his first film debut and was released in 1982, that really kind of shot the temple into the public consciousness and made it a popular tourist destination. In 1986, the temple received almost 2.5 million tourists in a single year. And from this period onwards is when you start to get the reconstruction of the temple complex as a whole in order to make it appear like an authentic temple. This also meant that things that had come to exist during the Maoist era, like people's homes and businesses, had to be relocated out of the complex because it no longer fit in with the aesthetic ideals of the Shaolin complex, which was supposed to be recreating a time before the Maoist period, which is just so ironic. In 2010, the Shaolin Temple was successfully listed as part of the World Cultural Heritage. However, in 2010, due to the high economic cost of the authentication projects, the Dongfeng government engaged a listed company, the China Travel International Investment in Hong Kong, to manage the complex with the local government. So this point is important because this is where you start to see the explicit commercialization and the interest of private investors and private equity, essentially, in making these locations commercially viable. This is no longer about reclaiming some specific point in history that's supposed to reflect a specific part of Chinese culture. It's also about making money. During this period, not only were the residents and businesses relocated, but over 44 buildings and 320 rooms were also destroyed because it was felt that they didn't fit in, again, with the reconstruction that they were going for. On top of the remodeling of the building, you now have these Shaolin monks martial arts shows that you've probably seen videos of, or you might have even seen in real life. Now, these Shaolin monks are about as authentic as the souvenirs that you can get from the gift shop, but it doesn't necessarily matter to the people who live and work there. When asked if commercialization would influence the authenticity of Shaolin heritage and culture, one interviewee said, "Shaolin culture is a big cultural system with Chan Buddhism as the center. What we commercialize is Shaolin martial arts and Shaolin medicine, not Chan Buddhism. The commercialization of Shaolin martial arts and medicine will not influence the authenticity of Chan Buddhism." But this obviously glosses over the fact that when you start replacing authentic monks and their authentic practices with practitioners who, one interview actually said, were chosen based on how good looking they were, it's obviously inherently going to degrade the spirit of what you're doing. Even if you think you're only commercializing the external facing aspects, it can't help but get to the soul of what you're doing. Once you commercialize that, once you start making money of that, once you start training teachers who then go out and make money themselves off of training individuals, there is something of the essence or the spirit or the original intention of that practice that gets eroded, and it's just unavoidable. This point that this interviewee has made kind of glosses over the fact that this place has been turned into a theme park, essentially. People aren't there to experience authentic Chan Buddhism and sort of learn more about it. They're there to have a day out, essentially, which is not the same thing at all. In the name of protecting authentic cultural heritage, the heritage authorization in the Shaolin case excludes the local resident space and results in its tendency towards being pseudo-classic theme park rather than an authentic heritage site in which all stakeholders are acknowledged and respected. Once you're somebody who lives and sort of works in one of these places, you're essentially becoming the same thing as a guy dressed in a Mickey Mouse costume or an Elsa dress who works for Disneyland. It's exactly the same thing, whether or not you believe you're practicing authentic Zen Buddhism or not. So at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned Furong. Furong Village annoys me specifically, I think more so than any of the other examples. I think mainly just because of the sheer number of videos online that are clearly showing how fake this place is, or at least how fake it seems to me. And yet all the comments underneath are people like gushing over how beautiful it is, which it is beautiful in its own way, but it's beautiful because it's been modernized, not because that's actually how it's being marketed, which is as an authentic ancient town. It wasn't even originally called Furong, which I think annoys me even more. It was originally called Wangcun, but its name was changed after, again, a film with the same name, Furong Village, became popular in the 1980s. Funnily enough, this film actually follows the story of a young woman who is attacked as a rich peasant during the Cultural Revolution. So again, the ironies are just piling on top of each other here, but essentially in the 80s depiction of the film, you can kind of see what it truly looked like. It actually looked quite nice in its kind of, you know, shabby, chic, authentic way. People were still living there, so it wasn't kind of trapped in time. It wasn't like an abandoned town. It is a place that had been worn away a little bit with time because people were still living there and still using it, but it still looked beautiful and authentic in its way. You can see that the floor is uneven, the furnishings and the materials that people are using are run down, parts of it are even crumbling. And the people who lived and worked there were dressed plainly, and they used simple and traditional tools, not to appear authentic, but because that's what they actually had access to. Now, I'm not saying that the people who lived there should be forced to stay, you know, dressing plainly, have no access to electricity, and only using traditional bamboo brushes instead of like vacuum cleaners. Obviously, they are allowed to modernize and update their standard of living. At what point in the transformation do people stop and go, wait a minute, maybe we've gone so far that we've actually become a parody of ourselves, as opposed to people who live and work in the modern world but have some connection to this ancient authentic site. And you might think, okay, well, maybe there's more benefit to these people to live and work and just pretend that, you know, they are the humble villagers who run these humble cake shops selling these traditional ancient style cakes in this ancient style town, and things have never changed for them, even though the paving is perfectly even and glossy and all of the hanging lanterns are lit up by electricity. There is no guarantee actually that the commercialization or Disney-fication of these towns actually benefits the people who live there or the people who live around there. I managed to find the diary of somebody who had visited Furong back in 2002 and who stayed in the guest house of a local who was actually from the region and had been from there before it became famous. By the way, the person's guest house looks absolutely amazing. So if you are wanting to go to Furong, then I would suggest you stay there because it actually looks really, really nice. Anyway, he tells a story about how in the beginning, yes, it was great that they were getting lots of tourists and they were able to make money, but actually over time, the natural conflicts that you would expect from over-tourism affects the people who are just trying to live there. When Boss Xiao opened his guest house in 2019, Furong Village had already turned itself into something more like a theme park with a waterfall rather than a sleepy traditional village. 6 performance shows a day, crowds already massive and growing, 200 plus new buildings doubling the town's size. Even now in 2002, with COVID affecting the tourist numbers, the place is packed. We walked around the village on our second day there. With the exception of the waterfall itself, it was everything I hate about Chinese tourist towns. Naggy vendors, expensive tourist traps, roasted sausages on a stick, vape stores, loud, dazzling performances in fake costumes. Overall, it was a little disappointing. When Boss Xiao picked us up later, it got worse. He asked us what we thought of Furong Village, and we answered it was okay, but too commercial. At least it helps the economy, I said. Yes, Furong is rich now, Xiao said, but we're still poor on my side of the river. I feel like the villagers of Furong have a lot of disruption to their lives, I added. They live inside a very busy tourist zone, there's no privacy, and the loud bars open quite late. How much do they get for their dividends? What dividends? He asked me. If they don't get a cut of the tickets, then why would they agree to have their village developed like this? They don't really. Actually, they have conflict with the development company. He told us that since last year, when the 5A rating was earned, relations have been very bad between the residents of Furong Village and the Furong Tourism Development Company. In fact, last year, about 300 of the residents and vendors called a general strike and closed their shops. Their complaints are as follows. The residents were upset that the attraction is open and selling tickets all the way to 11 p.m. when it used to be till 8 p.m, and they can't rest or get any peace and quiet. While residents of course don't have to pay to enter their own village, there was no special allowance for family members. If they weren't a Furong Village resident, they had to pay. It was a discount, but they still felt that it should be free. There were many rumours of sleazy business practices. According to Xiao, one very famous tofu restaurant that was featured in the movie was making 3 million renminbi a year, and the tourism company decided that they wanted a piece. They offered the owners a rent of 1 million renminbi to retire and allow the company to operate the shop instead, but the owners refused because they were happy to keep working. In retaliation, the tourism company stopped bringing packaged tour groups to the shop and let copycat vendors with the same product open a similar shop with the same name in the area. According to Xiao, after 1 week, the terms were renegotiated, the closing hours were pushed forward to 10 p.m, and the entry fee for neighbouring counties was lowered. They agreed to reopen afterwards, and it seems like it's been a cautious peace since then. Now, the key question is, knowing all of this, would I still recommend going to Furong? If you would be turned off by heavy commercialisation, the question for you is whether the scenery is good enough to balance out the negative aspects. Lots of places in China have this problem. Over-commercialisation, potentially ruining what are otherwise wonderful sights. It's a similar story here. The scenery wasn't ruined for me, and I still found a way to enjoy it. For others, it would be too much. On the other hand, if your concern is moral equity, and you want to boycott the attraction on those grounds, I'd invite you to rethink your position and go anyway. The loss of your individual tourist revenue means almost nothing to the investment company, but means everything to locals like Boss Xiao. So just in this story alone, we can see all of the conflicts that come along with over-commercialization and running your authentic heritage site as a tourist attraction if people still live there. If you want it to be a fully functioning place, an actual living, breathing part of your ongoing culture, you are naturally going to run into problems with the locals. During the course that I taught, one of the places that we discussed was a place called Xiaocheng, which is in Yanchuan County. It's got this village in it where the main attraction is paper cutting. So, you know, like making those pretty sort of patterns out of paper that kind of like extend into banners. And it's got other attractions as well. They've got like cave homestays where you can stay in traditional cave houses. You can buy the paper cuts and embroidery and things like that. And they have got the different younger song and dance performances. It's in a very remote location, but it still gets over 80,000 visitors a year, mainly Chinese tourists, which is really, really impressive. But at the same time, while it seems to be doing well on the surface, it really is just another example of how locals get strong-armed by the government to go along with their interests and whims with the promise of returns that never really materialize in the best way. So the reason that this particular place was chosen as somewhere to revive paper cutting as an ongoing living tradition is because basically some academics stumbled upon it and were like, this is great, we should make money out of this. From 2001 onwards, Beijing intellectuals persuaded women villagers to make and sell paper cuts as a source of income and male villagers to organize younger song and dance teams. They made sure that the women sought inspirations from folk legends, local stories, folk religions, and folk songs when making paper cuts. When they asked villagers to donate traditional agricultural gear, oil lamps, pottery containers, embroidery, paper lanterns, handmade cloths, and shoes for museum exhibits, they insisted that these exhibits were not for tourist visual consumption, but about reconnecting rural ordinary tools with Chinese culture and philosophy. By the end of 2011, a plan was in place. Xiaocheng could become a site where visitors appreciate the spectacular Yellow River landscape, tour around the old cave house communities, visit a folk museum, and still get in touch with traditional communities where women villagers continue the heritage of paper cutting. So it's all very lovely on the surface. However, almost immediately, the villagers themselves started clashing with the intellectuals and also the government, because what they actually wanted out of the project was not necessarily what was being projected onto them by the people who had come up with the idea. Villagers' objectives and concerns were different. They could not care less whether paper cutting was a medium of transmitting ancient totemic values and philosophy to the present. All they wanted was electric cables and tap water facilities. Many male villagers thought the plan of having their wives make paper cuts for tourists was simply crazy, if not outrageous, because that meant taking away major labour power from heavy agricultural work and household chores. It was only when there was a clear cost-benefit payoff to the villagers cooperating with the government that the villagers then decided to fully engage with the project. Seeing the villagers' effort, the county government eventually agreed to provide electric cables and tap water to Xiaocheng to make the Yellow River cultural tourist spot work. Villagers were overjoyed and decided to hold a ceremony to celebrate the setting up of the folk art village and the electric cable connection. Hao Guoqiang, the first elected leader of the folk art village, remembered this evening. Everyone was excited. We were all using oil lamps, and all of a sudden, there's electricity. Everyone sang and danced together. Many could not fall asleep that night. We did not believe in Teacher Jin before. Now we respect him like we respect Mao Zedong. Teacher Jin was the original academic who suggested transforming the town into a folk art village. So the commercialization goes even deeper here, because essentially the people who live in the village don't want to just act as a living museum, right? They want to participate in modern society and be treated like a modern person. And that means reaping the financial rewards just as much as the government would, and taking part of the profits gained by inviting tourists to the village, obviously. The place grew, visitors came from overseas. The people who lived there were not only able to reconnect with their past, but also to engage in modern society and to make a profit off of the lost traditions that they had been able to reclaim. Lots of people who had moved to the cities to become migrant workers were able to move back home and set up businesses comfortably in their hometown. But as this commercialization grew, so did the problems and tensions between locals and the government. The relationship between the art village leadership and the party leadership was never smooth from the beginning. Feelings of unease and awkwardness arose when, for example, the art village leader received incoming visitors and took the credit for hospitality without meeting the party village leaders. In turn, there were instances, for example, blackouts, frozen pipes, or visitor accidents, where the art village leadership had to rely on the party administrative leadership to keep things going, but the latter would then delay the requests. The county government continued to promote Xiaocheng as one of its major tourist spots, yet in its official tourism narrative, the county government no longer promotes paper cutting as a representative of a living civilization, but merely just as one other local art. It's quite clear that as long as this process is entangled with making money, then there's not going to be any real winners and losers. You're always going to have this tension between those with less political capital and those who have all the political capital but don't actually do the work on the ground to keep these places running. These sorts of places also highlight the fact that slowly but surely the importance of overall economic development is replacing the importance of reclaiming that cultural history and that heritage. The idea is not to preserve ancient sites from a cultural perspective, but almost purely from an economic perspective. if I'm going to bother restoring all of these ancient buildings, rebuilding these temples, teaching people how to dance and sing and make costumes and cut paper, then what is my financial incentive to do so? You can argue about whether or not it's better to preserve something as it is or conserve it by rebuilding it to a semi-original state. But can you really argue about whether or not placing a fine dining restaurant in the middle of your authentic ancient village is the same thing as cultural heritage? There is a huge difference between visiting a town where people live, where ordinary people can explain to you, you know, this is the history of this place, and going to a Disney village where people dress up in fake costumes that were made in a factory in China and perform made-up songs and dances for a pageant. These people are not authentic minorities who are living and breathing this kind of culture every day. They're employees of the state who have to perform these dances 5 times a day for tourists. And not to dismiss everything that I've just spent like 45 minutes talking about, but it kind of doesn't matter because this is what tourists want to see. Tourism in China is an incredibly important industry. The number of domestic trips in China reached 6 billion in 2019, and the total revenue generated by tourism in China amounted to around 6.6 trillion yuan in the same year. And most of this is driven by internal tourism. So it really just depends on what Chinese people like to see. And according to one study, research shows that Chinese visitors acquire experiences that they perceive to be authentic when visiting a contrived attraction. Although they do not replicate exactly any category of Western objective authenticity, they instead constitute an authentic experiential dimension in a typical Oriental context, which is comprehensively explicated by combining the image of a national cultural theme and the elements of functional construction created by tourist places in a new ancient town. Which is a very long-winded academic wishy-washy way of saying that it doesn't matter if a place is fake or real. The only thing that matters is that a place looks like what Chinese people think an authentic place would look like and feels like what Chinese people think an authentic place would feel like, and therefore makes them feel more in touch with their past and therefore more Chinese. And also, like most tourists around the world, what actually matters to Chinese people the most is the fact that they have a good time. Tourists are not overly concerned about objective authenticity as long as they had a positive and enjoyable experience. Indeed, whether the past has been accurately recreated has become less important, and the importance of providing tourists with a sense of authenticity has increased. And this is why those like fake reconstructions of European towns like Venice Water Town or Thames Town or Austrian Town are really, 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 really popular with Chinese tourists. It's also not just the case that Chinese tourists prefer what we would consider inauthentic culture. Compounding that is also the fact that Chinese tourists don't really like actual authenticity. And by that I mean anything that rubs up against their modern sensibilities basically is just a no-no. Phenomena and elements of the original and past in ancient towns that are contrary to the values of modern civilization are considered negatively authentic by both tourists and residents. For example, unhygienic environments violates modern health standards, and poverty and shabbiness violates modern values of anti-poverty. When some negative phenomena and elements strongly convict with modern values, tourists will think that the phenomena and elements are not true or even fabricated. For example, some tourists in Zhouzhuang questioned whether the habit of washing wooden toilet tubs in the river ever really existed. In some Qiang-inhabited regions, there's a social custom called curse marriage. Before the wedding, the bride's family and groom's family are expected to throw serious recriminations at each other because they believe that the more powerful the yelling, the happier the bride and groom will be in their future marriage. Unfortunately, tourists view this custom as a sensational stage performance. When they see the brides and grooms humiliate each other's parents, tourists feel psychologically uncomfortable and hurt because they experience negative things that are contrary to common sense. So not only is the historical accuracy of authentic heritage questioned in these cases, but people will outright say, I don't like that, I don't like it, I don't want to see that, and therefore you should take it away. This is why the authenticity of a building doesn't matter as long as it's pleasing to the eye. For example, if we go back to the Shaolin Temple, the local residents did not care about the material authenticity of the buildings. As one local resident interviewee said, "Of course we local people knew these buildings were just newly reconstructed, but who cared? No one. Many tourists came here to visit the temple, they didn't care, it was really there, and that's okay." But is it okay? Does authenticity matter? From what I've gathered, there is a difference between conservation and preservation that we have to acknowledge. Preservation aims to keep things in that sort of freeze frame, perfect image of what it looks like now, which represents how it's traveled through history. Whereas conservation in China, or even in the broader sort of Asian sense, aims to keep things looking and feeling like they were, whilst removing all of the icky parts that make modern people feel uncomfortable, in order to give people a sense of the past and a chance to experience that past from themselves. Now, we know that there's no way that you can really actually truly understand what it was like to be an ancient person living in ancient times just by like visiting a Disney-fied village. But if we actually acknowledge that thought on a daily basis, then the entire tourism industry would just crumble around us. It's not that people don't recognize this fact for themselves. It's more that if people started to acknowledge it, then the disconnect between not only people and their own history, but people and the people who are in charge of maintaining that history and pretending to be a part of that history would become more and more apparent. The people who live in these tourist attractions, who dress up in these costumes and who do these dances, don't actually live like that. They live more like the tourists who come to see them than the people whose culture they're imitating, right? The people of the past, their own ancestors. They might be connected to them, but that connection is all but lost and it's now being refabricated. It's also perpetuated in Western mindsets as well, right? Like when you travel, you expect to go to these poorer countries and expect their locals to perform for you, you know, like show us your clothing, show us your food that makes you different. You don't necessarily expect things to be trapped in time or people to be trapped in a place where they're not able to engage in modern culture, but you still want to see that when you traveled somewhere it was worth going because you saw something different to what you see every day. It's kind of like pretend play when you're playing with a toddler, right? You both know it's not real, but you're engaging in the pageantry so that one of you can have a good time and one of you gets some other benefit out of it. In China's case, it's very apparent that the government will keep up this act of rejuvenating cultural heritage, even if it means that true authentic culture ends up being erased and replaced by this inauthentic version in the process. For instance, established by a local real estate company in 2006 in Chuxiong County, Yunnan, the old town of the Yi minority group serves as an example of how local ethnic culture has been used for commercial purposes to expedite the development of tourism and real estate. The buildings in the recently erected old town of the Yi minority group, mainly in the form of souvenir shops and accommodation for tourists, are designed for the purpose of showcasing ancient Yi architecture, culture and traditions. Classical symbols and decor are purposely used to adorn windows and roofs and make the buildings attractive for tourists and visitors. Assessed through the prism of the China principles, this project is in no way related to the heritage conservation and authenticity. It's the Chinese people's quest for authenticity and the visitors' imaginativeness that authorize and merchandise this old town. The site's existential value is not attached to any historical meaning or archaeological evidence. It arises from people's marked nostalgia for their heritage, which has developed in the course of rapid modernization and industrialization over the past few decades. I guess my question is there a wrong or right way to view heritage? Or is there a specific way that we should be approaching renovation and preservation? Should you pick one over the other? If it allows people to thrive economically, reconnect with their past, take advantage of their knowledge of the past in order to make some money, then why not? Who's to say that having a Starbucks in the middle of your 1,000-year-old ancient town is any less culturally enriching than a pile of stones in the middle of a field? But personally, I can't help but feel a bit uneasy about the whole thing. even though it's not even my culture, I guess there's just this sense of loss, of like erasing things that can never actually be brought back. It feels like we're sacrificing things that should not be sacrificed in order to make money, essentially. And maybe there's no real answer to this, and it all just boils down to your personal opinion. But going back to the Xiaocheng paper cutting village, there's a quote from the author, and I just want to leave you all on this note. It's important to understand heritage making and its authenticity, not simply by judging whether it's a replica or an original, historically existed or recently invented. All heritages are products of fabrication, weaving history and fables, legends and facts together. But that does not make a heritage inauthentic. Instead, part of the heritage's authenticity lies in the production of multiple meanings generated by contesting narratives. This is particularly true in China, where the Communist Party state often holds a tight control on interpreting history and tradition of local places. Every heritage making thus becomes a crucial protest of contesting the official party state version of truth, and therefore generating alternative historical facts and interpretations. It is these various alternative historical views and new claims of traditions that make heritage authentic and meaningful. So that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do follow me on Substack and Twitter and buy me a coffee and all of those things. By the time this video comes out, I think I would have already done my live. So if you joined that, thank you. If you didn't, you should be able to catch the recording on YouTube. I don't know what we discussed because for me, it hasn't happened yet. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you again in the next one.